run all the way through it. You'll pick them up in a chapter called The Romantic Reaction in Science in the Modern World, in which there is as much poetry as philosophy, including Wordsworth's poetry. You see. Because he's seeing the philosophical content of the Romanticist reaction against the mechanistic science and the rationalism of the Enlightenment. You see. And all right, that's part of 19th century idealism, but where Whitehead gets it from becomes pretty explicit. And I found verbal identities between Whitehead's poems and some of the language in, did I say Whitehead's poems? Wordsworth's poems, and some of the language in Whitehead's Process and Reality, which is his long technical tome on metaphysics. You see, it's fascinating stuff. So if you want to read Whitehead extensively, I suggest you read Wordsworth's poems at the same time. It's very interesting. All right, that's the first influence. The second influence from modern science, after all, he was first a mathematician and a scientist. He cooperated with Bertrand Russell in, I think it was 1903, in a work which really introduced symbolic logic into the 20th century. A work called the Tractate. The Bertrand Russell, no, it's not the Tractatus, that's what led me right, the Principia Mathematica. The Principia Mathematica. I have a prompter over here, you'll see, to help me. The Principia Mathematica, Principles of Mathematics, in which Russell and Whitehead, both of whom were teaching at Cambridge at the time, cooperated on the volume, essentially showing that mathematics is reducible to formal logic, and therefore introducing mathematical symbolism into formal logic, so as to eliminate the ambiguity of variables and make possible the formalized deductive systems that logicians like. So he was first a mathematician who, like other mathematicians of the time, was very interested in logic and therefore in philosophy of science. And during his stay at the University of London, where he was teaching philosophy of science, he published 3 works in theoretical physics. Well, at least where theoretical physics borders into philosophy of science. All right, he was very much into this. What in modern science influences philosophy? One, undoubtedly, is developmental biology, both at the macro level, evolutionary theory, and at the micro level, genetics, developmental biology. He doesn't say as much about it as he does about physics. He was closer to physics. And you'll find that in Science in the Modern World, he talks about the philosophical significance of 3 modern developments in physics. First of all, electromagnetic field theory. Electromagnetic field theory. Whereby we think in terms of force fields, rather than in terms simply of bodies with gravitational pull. Force fields. Second, quantum physics, where the basic unit are, if you like, units of energy, rather than solid pellets of matter. Quantum physics. And third, Einstein's relativity theory, including space-time relativity, general theory of relativity, E equals mc squared, relativity theory. The professor who taught the Whitehead course I taught in graduate school said that there were only two people who really understood relativity theory. One was Einstein, the other was Whitehead. Now, whether there's been any improvement on that in the last 200 years or whatever it was, I don't know. But at least he seems to. You're awake, okay. but at least he seems to understand relativity theory. And he weaves it into his metaphysics, remarkably. Now, notice what's happening. Here he is a naturalist rather than an idealist. Here he is interested in modern physics. He's going, therefore, as a naturalist interested in modern science, going to be a scientific realist, taking science as telling us in a provisional way about reality. The idealist had a phenomenalist view of science. Whitehead has a realist view of science. Yet both of them seem to have the same ends, purposes, namely preserving a romanticized view of life, nature, and as we'll see later, insisting that there is no ultimate separation between fact and value. The world of nature is value-laden. Now, the idealist wanted to say that and therefore rejected the scientific account of reality. Whitehead wants to say that, but he accepts the scientific account of reality. How come? Well, because of the change in modern science. He maintains that developmental biology and energistic physics, relativity theory, enable us to say that the physical facts of mundane existence are loaded with value, meaning, purpose. He's coming back to a teleological interpretation of the scientific universe. Yes. So here's going to be a philosophical naturalist who's going to find moral and aesthetic value inherent in things. Yeah, he talks a lot about science in his writings. He takes it that philosophy has a twofold function with regards to science. One is to critique scientific abstractions. There's that word abstraction again. The abstractions which take some theoretical notion like equality for being ultimate reality, a mistaken abstraction. To critique those abstractions is part of the function of philosophy, and he critiques mechanistic science, and you will find that's the major function of the first 6 chapters of the book you're reading. But then the second function is to engage in what he calls flights of speculative imagination based on modern science. In other words, to extrapolate from science into a speculative metaphysical scheme. And he likens those flights of speculative imagination to what plane travel was like in the 1920s, if you can imagine that. Namely, you'd soar aloft above the clouds too, but the clouds, in this heady sort of world of speculative imagination up above the clouds. And periodically, to get your bearings in the world of fact, you'll drop down below the clouds and find where you are. You see. I suppose today, if he were writing, he'd say radar checks, or something of that sort. But in other words, flights of philosophical speculation, metaphysical speculation, yeah, but always taking off from and returning to the facts of science and ordinary experience, concrete experience, because he's realistic about both. So, if you like, he has two sorts of empirical points of reference. Science, concrete experience. Not the abstractions of an empiricist like Locke, but the sort of experience that we can phenomenologically describe introspectively. Self-consciousness is the window on reality. Self-conscious introspection. So, you'll find that in the light of that, he is always denouncing certain fallacies. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Oops. Oh, I can't even spell. All right, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness and the fallacy of simple location. Well, if concrete is the opposite of abstract, you can tell what the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is. Assigning concreteness to sheer abstraction. So the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is the fallacy of taking abstractions to be real. Assuming that what are really intellectual abstractions, theoretical abstractions, have concrete existence. Not so. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And he's always accusing mechanistic science of that. Then the other is the fallacy of simple location, of assuming that there are fixed points in a uniform space, uniform time of a Newtonian sort. Simple location. So all you have to do is to call out the coordinates and you can locate the thing. Failing to see that motion is in both place and time, and the spatial coordinates change varying with the time. Relativity of spatial relationship to time. And consequently, the notion of a simple location, such as we use in geography, just is an abstraction that may be useful at some levels, but quite useless at others. So, accordingly, with the influence of modern science. Now, the third one may surprise you. The Alexandrian Church Fathers